What a lot of educators get anxious about is whether they've got to test their students. Do I have to assess them? Simple answer is no, you don't have to. Sometimes simulations are very good simply as ice-breaking activities, that they let students be someone else, literally, metaphorically, and that acts as a disinhibitor. It allows them to start to engage with their group. So simulations can be a really good way of just simply ice-breaking, building a community of your students, and I've seen some very powerful effects of that, that even 2 or 3 years down the line students are still talking about the day that they had the game, and do you remember when, and can you remember how so-and-so was. So it can be very powerful, and that's not at all about assessment. However, if we're using a simulation in the context of a taught module on an undergraduate or a master's program, then we really have to think about whether we need to test people. And I think here there are 3 options. Firstly, we might test people on what they're doing in the simulation. How good a negotiator are you? So I've watched the game, I've seen all these people, I've taken notes, I'm giving you a mark and giving you a mark. If you're doing that, you need to be confident that you can observe everyone. From practical experience, watching more than about 5 people over 2 hours is impossible. That there's simply too much going on in a room in terms of communication, in terms of other activities, things that might be happening around the formal discussion, if people are passing notes or if you're using computer elements as well. Can you actively observe that in a way that lets you give a meaningful mark? And importantly, thinking about assessment, particularly in a British context, can you evidence that? So that means you need to have some kind of recording of the negotiation, of the simulation, and something that an external examiner can look at and say, yes, I can understand that. So I would tend to be hesitant about assessing performance during the simulation itself, for those kind of reasons, because it tends to create a lot of quality assurance kind of issues. However, that still leaves 2 other options. First option is that you are testing students on their development of knowledge. So if a simulation is part of a bigger package of teaching, so part of a module, for example, where you do some lectures, you do some seminars, then you have a simulation, then you have some kind of final assessment, then the simulation becomes a way of stressing the utilization, the understanding of the knowledge in an active kind of way. So it becomes a reinforcement technique rather than perhaps a development of some substantive new ability. So in that sense, you can use conventional assessment methods like an essay, like an exam, and the assessment then is very clearly built into the wider module. Third option is that you can assess students in relation to their reflection on their performance in a simulation. That you might ask them not to write about their knowledge development, although that might be part of it, but instead you say, I want you to write about how you have done. So instead of the onus being on you, the instructor, to observe people, you're asking students to observe themselves, to reflect on what they've done. Now, in my case, where I'm teaching about negotiation technique, that becomes clearly aligned with the wider material that we have. We've got various scenarios where students are exposed to different difficult situations for negotiation, and they're asked then to reflect on that in a dossier at the end of the module. So they're taking their knowledge, they are using it actively in the simulation, they are then reflecting on that in their final piece. And I can then assess their ability to reflect. So in terms of developing critical skills, critical thinking, self-reflection, all of those things that we want out of our students generically, and that's true not just in politics but in other subjects too, we have the scope then to do something along those lines. Again though, the key message is that testing students on what happened in the simulation is something that needs some unpacking. we need to decide whether we do it at all, and if we are doing it, what it is we're trying to achieve.